Thank you very much. Thanks for the nice invitation. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being with us after the conference dinner yesterday. Yeah, and I try to have some kind of interaction during the plenary, so I hope to keep you up awake. Having too much data, yeah, that's the starting point of the whole thing. And actually, I would like to take you a little bit to a story and tell a little bit about history of what has happened before. So probably everybody of you knows this kind of picture here, which is actually the blue marble, a pretty iconic thing that was shot by a human being. So this was something like remote sensing, as we in the very, very early. It was shot 1972 on one of the Apollo missions. And it's actually pretty hard to take because it's hard for a human being to get the whole planet on one single camera. And it was iconic for the environmental movement. We now know it if we open Google Earth or anything else. It's so used to us that perhaps the function that the picture had in 1972 might got lost. So if you go a little bit further and take the same thing at night, you see you start unpacking what the issue is that comes across with that. The US is pretty populated, so mostly all the habitable areas of the world are used by humans. And that 20 years later led to a very important conference, the Conference of the Nations in Rio de Janeiro. And I learned a lot, especially also in Luxembourg, that I more or less have to start there because not everybody is not as aware of these processes which are going on. And in 1992, yeah, the UNFCCC was funded, one of the conventions of the UN that wanted to take care of the planet. And this was the Climate Convention. The Climate Convention, luckily, had a processor, IPCC, which is actually every year in the media when it's about climate change, was funded even before that. So this convention that was supposed to deal with the question of climate change had a scientific advisory board. And that could start collecting data, collecting knowledge, trying to unpack the question, is climate change a human-driven phenomena, and what do we really do about it? To be honest, we have been smarter before. There was a pretty cool paper by Stefan Rahmstorff coming out 2 years ago, analyzing what Exxon Valdez knew about climate change, even in the 1960s, 70s. And the scenario studies Exxon Valdez did even before Rio were really great. They were really precise. They were unpacking that, what then was in a very tedious process developed later on by IPCC. What is a little bit under the radar by others is that there was also the Convention on Biodiversity. So the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. And that started working about preserving habitats, trying to stop biodiversity loss and ecosystem functioning. But it took them till 2012 to get their scientific advisory body, which is finally called, for all the Germans here, especially for those close to Bonn, it's called IPBES. So it's not IPBES, it's the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So we have all these fora, we have all these people that work with that, and the question is, does it really matter? And this is where I would like to engage you. Working, great. So if you check in, I have the first question for you. In 2025, when the Paris Accord was gravelled by UNFCCC, member states agreed to follow this 1.52 degree target. And the business as usual scenarios in these days estimated a 3.6, 3.9 temperature increase by 2100. Given business as usual scenarios today, where are we? 1.5 degree, 1.9, 1.6, or even 2.9. Okay, People put on their glasses again, so seems fine. Oh, quite good. Most of you got it right. Of course, we are not with 1.5 degrees. This is not where we are here. But the message from that is we actually made progress till then. So these conventions really are not completely useless assets usually in the media. So what I would like to do is to explain to you how do we get there. And that is also, of course, also about data and about knowledge and about synthesizing scientific knowledge which is out there. And I would like to do it with you to have a little bit of a view on what happened last year in December in Windhoek, in Namibia, where the assessment report on interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food, and health were gravelled and were decided. And why is that an issue? So why are we actually talking about a very complex thing, trying to relate biodiversity, water, food, health, etc.? That actually came from the knowledge that energy production, if it comes to climate change scenarios, might be at odds with biodiversity protection. And this is where both of these different fora came together, the conventional biodiversity and the conventional climate change. So why the nexus? Why the interrelationships? Just a few examples on that. If we're thinking about food security, then food security is not maintained without any ecosystem functioning, without specifically pollination. 75% of the crops that we are eating depend on all the small little bugs and birds and bats that do the pollination service for us. So a market stand without pollination would look like the left-hand side. If it comes to water, food security, and biodiversity, if you look at rice fields, rice, a major commodity which is needed for food security, especially in Asia and in the global south, needs water to protect these plants from pests, which are needed during the seedling time. And you also need sufficient biodiversity there to control herbivory and others. If it comes to biodiversity, food security, water, and health, look at India, where rice fields are burned pretty quickly after the first harvesting time to allow for a second vegetation period, which produces lots of smog, which if you've ever been to Delhi, then you really know that Feinstaubbelastung, okay. That dust is a major issue, which goes up to 1,000 ppm in the air. And if you look at the connection between biodiversity, water, and climate, if you look over from the Titicaca Lake to the east, then you see at lunchtime clouds coming up. You see the planet breathing. So a sufficiently proper working Amazon ecosystem is needed to have a stable climate. So we have all these connections and we try to dig into it. And what we did in this report is we tried to study the data and we tried to study the trajectories, what is going on, what has been going on in the last years. So we were trying to harvesting various servers, trying to get time series, trying to get the data on, showing us what's actually happening in the last years with these indicators. So and then to FAO, you go to World Bank, you go to various sources and try to come up with a synthesized picture, which is probably helpful for decision makers. And what you see is biodiversity is going down, ecosystem intactness is going down, threatened species is going down, freshwater availability, unfortunately, is also going down, while life expectancy is increasing a lot, while food supply is increasing a lot, and unfortunately, climate-related disasters also goes slowly up. You see pretty clearly the COVID pandemic within the life expectancy curve, and you also see when it comes to food security, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changes in Eastern Europe, which switched a lot food provisioning even globally. And we were unpacking that just to get an idea on how the world is different. We were unpacking that by income categories and by income levels per country. So you can categorize countries by low, lower medium, higher medium, and high income categories. That's on the lower. And then you present that, like here, you have a big room, and then you have to defend all your results, like at school with the teacher, to the delegates of the membership parties of the convention. And then you look into these phases. And there are lots of critique and lots of questions of people saying, why did you do it that way or that way? So you have to really defend your research. You have to defend your results to the policymakers, to the stakeholders, to the delegates of the countries. And you see lots of people looking pretty critically. And I picked a few pictures out of the global South countries. So like our friend from Brazil, like Chile, not necessarily Luxembourg, but Namibia also. And the first critique that we got, and that was a funny one, the first critique that we got at the second day in the morning was, why didn't you use developing countries and developed countries? And that was, of course, a political question. But it goes back to the data, because it's a question of how to categorize those. And then it is really something that you have to answer on the spot within the conference. And as you probably might know, that it's not only these kinds of graphs which are there, there's also lots of analysis which comes afterwards based on this categorization. And you don't want to redo the entire analysis during negotiations. So I was kind of reluctant to keep our analysis. So we had to defend it. And it was funny because we spent a day on studying the difference between income level countries and developing countries. And you simply do a matrix like, okay, who is counting itself as developing country and which income category is the country in, etc. So you do a pretty simple Excel sheet. It's really not rocket science. But at the end, what you encounter is that 50% of countries which are denoted as developing country already belong to the category of high income countries. We are talking about countries like Singapore, Qatar, and others. And then you wonder, why is that? And you go back really to the nitty-gritty small printed stuff in the reports, which is actually hard to find, that you see that at the end of the day, nobody of the official international fora is using that category anymore, neither WHO, neither the World Bank, neither FHO, so the agricultural institution, because it is throughout the sovereign decision of the state counting itself a developing country or not. And that's not science. And that was the final argument where we were then saying in one of the Friends of the Chair groups, hey guys, this is science, we stick with that. I know there's a political aspect to it, but we stick with this categorization, which was kind of tensions, but we made that through. And I tell you why the whole thing is. So what we also try to understand is, how are these nexuses really geographically mapped globally? Where are they? So we try to find a map on the terrestrial realm as well as on the marine realm, collecting various data from threatened species, food production, et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to the marine realm, of course, there's nothing like an indicator for human health. And we did some kind of geographic analysis and came up with a map that showed us multiple threats for people with positive outcomes of these indicators, or negative outcomes, or even with trade-offs. So even this darkish yellow, bluish color, there are the trade-offs. Reddish colors are the mutual losses, where people really suffer from having no good access to these to these nexus elements. And the greenish ones is where people benefit from positive outcomes. And you see, of course, again, the global south being either captured by trade-offs or by negative outcomes. And at the end of the day, the summary is that 62% of the human population benefit from good outcomes on the nexus elements, but also 25% suffer from that. So, and of course, it's more than 100%, but that's the trade-offs. And most of the negative impacts are with low-income countries. 72% of the low-income countries suffer from bad effects. And even we could do the analysis on indigenous local people. So that is something like a pretty comprehensive summary on where we are these days. Okay, so I have another question for you. It comes to income level. In 1990, I need to read it there, 58% of the world's population live in low-income countries. What is the share today? Lars, I'll take you as a signal that everything is. Let's see where you are. Quite undecided auditorium. It's just 9%. The global society got really wealthy. It's a kind of a misconception that we have. And that is also where the hope is. So we do have the means to change things. It is a distribution issue. It is not the question of where the opportunities are. And I highly recommend a web page that illustrates, for instance, how the food aspect looks like. If you go to the former web page of Hans Rosling and his family, who passed off too early, they put together a really great data set of pictures that you can analyze, where you can see how people live by income country. And you can see how their families look like by income level, how their food look like, and various others. Have a look. It's about toys. It's about public transport. It's about work life. It's about whatever. You get an idea of how this world might look like, even if you don't have the chance to visit people where they live. Okay, then let's go to food. Another question. You probably know how much food intake you need every day on average. You probably learn it if your partner is pregnant and you're thinking about healthy diets, etc. And you know what the calorie intake is, or if you try to lose weight, also know. So, how much food is produced per capita? So measured per day and per capita in calories, from 1,700 kilocalories to 8,000 kilocalories. How much food? Globally, again, it's a global average. That doesn't tell us that much, but let's see. Okay. Just waiting for Lars to take a decision and then. Not that bad. It is amazing. It is so much food in terms of nutrition is produced, and it is actually you're guessing 3,500 kilocalories, which is the exact estimate for high-income countries. This is what we are doing. It is a little bit lower. It's 3,000, but as you say, it's too much, and that's actually where it comes to our diets. And actually, this 8,000 is also a real value because that applies to the US. So, and now the question is, I guess you guys would expect more data and stuff and these things, but to be honest, it gets even worse because if you try to come up with solutions, you need to get a little bit more qualitative, and then it gets really questionable. So just to see how the process is, we are putting together these assessment reports, put together scientific publications, the evidence, which have been for that report 6,500. NGO reports, all this stuff, lots of paper. In 3 years' work, more than 150 people put together a 1,700 pages report. And by chapters, these are the length. And that is then, to make it digestible, condensed to a more or less 60 pages report, which is supposed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And that is a process that started 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, we haven't been that far, that we didn't achieve that much in terms of AI and in terms of digesting, having something machine-based studying this kind of evidence. So what I mean is, it is so much qualitative information that you need to digest and that you have to interpret and that you have to put together and to see and have to weigh out what is the most important thing that gets you forward. But what people are suggesting since last year is that could also be done by AI type of tools. which is actually really intriguing and really, really interesting, because the task itself is something like synthesizing things together, but it needs, of course, some kind of interpretation. So the diversity of documents really tells us that might be helpful, but that is really still a way for research. It might be really helpful to make that. And on the other hand, policymaker will use it. Policymaker will ask ChatGPT for these kinds of results. And it is a need to get the evidence behind. And saying that this 1,700 pages is a lot, nobody reads it, that's wrong. Lots of policymakers go down to its text and use the information in there for their legal texts and for their documents that they need to prepare for any kind of governance procedures. So that goes in. And my idea, my vision, that also goes back a little bit to the introduction today, is that's actually some kind of research that I would like to implement at this new center in Luxembourg. So that was the advertising. Or if you want to have a look at the webpage there. So what does the qualitative analysis of the whole thing tells us? One thing is we were moving away from the classical drivers that deteriorate our nature to the indirect drivers, asking us the questions, what are the indirect drivers that determine the nexus elements? And you can see that there are the regular suspects in there, like GDP, like material intensity, like trade, also like population growth, urbanization, regulations, etc., etc. And we try to assess what has a strong positive and a strong negative impact. And that is based on simple, systematic review study of literature. Pretty nasty, pretty long. And at the end of the day, luckily, policymaker didn't negotiate any error because we could provide the sufficient evidence. But what was negotiated a lot was the line under armed conflicts. It was the first time in the world that we have sufficient scientific evidence that armed and military conflicts have a global impact to various nexus elements, which is literally the Ukrainian war. We do have sufficient evidence that this was influencing global food security. It was increasing prices for fertilizers. The most severe effects were not through not being able to ship out grains from Ukraine, but it was through the increasing prices for fertilizer for the global south. And that was mostly through the boycott of Russian energy. But anyhow, it is a war that happens on a place where the most fertile soils are, where lots of hazardous materials are. And that, again, is something that was not really perceived well during negotiations. And then it looks like this. So if you are in there, you have a certain thing of text, you can't see it. I blurred it because this is streamed. And that's actually, this is text that is negotiated, and we do have security issues. It should not go out there, so I should not tell you what the initial texts are that has been changed. So that's why I did. But anyhow, what happens there is you have all the text, it gets highlighted, and then people fight about the text. And one thing was, of course, that this guy over there with the white shirt, who was actually a negotiator from the UN Security Council. So this is really a tough guy. He wanted us to get all the Ukrainian war thing out of the report. And if you say so, sorry guys, the rules are, if we have the scientific evidence, it stays in. We simply had to downtone all the wordings. Of course, it was not politically very polite to talk about an invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Well, we just rephrased. But it led to the point that lots of people have been really disappointed and have been really frustrated, and it really took a long time. And that's a positive sign. That's important. People care about it. People try to block it. So this is not, we are not doing useless stuff. It's really something that is relevant for policy. So it took us twice the time for negotiating that than this was planned. But at the end of the day, it was really something. So what we are suggesting at the end is having response options which relate to conserving ecosystems, relate to restore ecosystems, manage ecosystems, etc., etc. And people went, in this longish text, went through all these options which are out there that help to improve, that help to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, secure climate change, change climate change, and provide sufficient food, provide water, and increase human health. And we try to identify which of these more than 20 mechanisms, more than 70 response options, which is addressing which of the nexus elements and how can they be categorized. And further on, all these things have been analyzed in their impact for the various elements. Where are synergies? Where are trade-offs? Which are most beneficial, whatnot? And we try to be not policy prescriptive and just handing over something like a tool set that can then be used by decision makers to apply it to their regular thing. But also, it was used in terms of case studies, trying to explain longishly and pretty detailedly what did, for instance, indigenous communities doing better compared to classical management strategies to preserve biodiversity and to help restoring water levels or improving food provisioning. And it is even going through the newspapers where people talk about India, about their zero net farming, etc., etc. So it's a pretty comprehensive report. This is what it makes worth with 1,700 pages. But that is all at the end, very qualitative analysis and a very careful assessing. Getting back to data, let's have a final look on the economy. And that is actually something that went through the media afterwards, which also was shocking to me. Another question to the audience would be, what do you think, what's the size of the global economy in total? So just to get a range. I didn't know it. It is 100 trillion US dollar. So it's nice because this 100 makes the whole thing and discussing on percentage values quite easily. So what people from the World Economic Forum, and that was used in the report too, were identified is that 10 to 25 trillion US dollars are negative effects of today's economy. So this kind of unaccounted for negative side effects, which are at the end positive for global GDP. This is the same weird thing like you are hitting somebody, you are hitting a biker with your car at the street and you're doing harm to him, but the entire thing in terms of healing, securing, etc. is good for the GDP. That's the thing. So this is all the damages we do to nature, which is mostly CO2 emissions and loss of ecosystem functions. And if it comes back to actual numbers, 5.3 trillion US dollar are negative funding initiatives or expenditure coming from the private sector, which are bad for biodiversity, and 1.7 from the public sector, which says that the public sector is quite aware of doing things properly, but the private sector is not regulated sufficiently. But on the positive side, it's only 170 billion US dollar, which are positive funding for nature, biodiversity, and climate. And that is just a minor fraction that helps to preserve things. Most of them goes to biodiversity, a little bit goes to combination of those. And unfortunately, this analysis does not include investments for climate change, which just flags out here 1%. So that needs to be updated sooner or later. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much because that is just a minor fraction to what the global economy today is doing. So it's distribution and it's about the right investment. Yeah, at the end, we made it more or less. Everybody has been happy after all these negotiations. And it is more or less also a result of this kind of 1 or more weeks of really nerve-wracking discussions. And at the end of the day, we also learned that, again, all these aspects are picked up. And the other thing is a very positive one that I always appreciate to see that people still discuss this or the whole thing with each other. So it's not about fighting, but discussing things. But to be honest, to implement these changes, I think we are really challenged. So besides the military conflict thing, one thing that we analyzed was also the level of liberal democracies over time. That is an indicator that is provided by a Global Policy Institute that is trying to assess how many people live under a regime which can be called a liberal democracy. And when all these fora in 1992, when we started up, were founded, we were quite of an upward trend. But at the end of the day, we are in the same absolute value, but on a downward trajectory. And that is actually the part where we are fighting against it. So we felt a little bit like being blocked with just because of blocking people, but actually we have to preserve that kind of way of negotiating things and coming as a community to solutions. And actually in that data, we don't yet have the elections from Trump in, we don't have Poland in, we don't have Netherlands. So that's still the last elections are not considered. So the curve might be even below. Okay, actions. What I think is that one has to understand that this blame game should stop. It's not that the individual is the only one who is responsible to implement changes. It is not that's only politics, and it's not that's only the economy. All these things have to interact, and it's that all three elements of a society have to take efforts to implement changes. And finally, this transformation needs to much more look at all these indirect drivers that we contact and try to find the data there, which is justice, inequality, economy, and just go back from simple land use questions. But let me close with a very simple statement, which is pretty old. So anyone who believes in indefinite growth of anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. I don't know if there are economists in the room, but anyhow, Kenneth E. Boulding was an economist, so I think I'm able to dare to quote him. And Kenneth E. Boulding was consulting the US government, but that's really a long time ago. It was in the 1992, I think he was still part of the government system. That's where we are. Thank you for listening.